Continuing with our team coverage as the Arctic blast hits part of the ArkLaTex, one of the areas of great concern is Texarkana.
And that is where we continue our live team coverage this morning with Rick Rowe and Jeff Dillard keeping an eye on conditions there. So let's get right to it, fellas. What are you seeing? We saw some wet road conditions down here.
You know what? We haven't seen that. Drove up from Shreveport-Bossier on I-49. I-49 pretty clear, relatively dry. I'm not saying entirely dry. We have noticed a few puddles of water we're headed right now east on I-30, again right here in Texarkana. And thus far, the news is basically good. I'm not saying the weather's great, of course not. It's cold, about 30 degrees, pretty good wind. And there is a little bit of mist now, we've just noticed. So I'm assuming that will be freezing mist, and who knows what might come of that. But in terms of what's manifest right now on the thoroughfares, this is I-30. We're going to get off. This is State Line Road. Why don't we turn off on State Line Road when we get a chance? But not seeing anything serious in terms of driving. Certainly no roads closed. Not noticing any ice on roads. And things look pretty good at this point. Also, the last time we were here about a month ago, we had significant accumulation of ice on trees. None of that have we noticed here. So I would not anticipate there's going to be any damage to power lines, trees down, and that kind of situation that can manifest. So thus far, at least in this part of Texarkana, on I-30 and secondary roads, pretty clear, pretty good. And that's good news to report. We're glad we have some good news here. Again, it is cold, and if you're going to get out, there is a wind, and it's going to be biting, so obviously dress appropriately. But in terms of travel on local roads in the Texarkana region, I would say pretty much all clear, although obviously always be aware of black ice on those overpasses and bridges. Coming back to you.
We are bringing you live team coverage on this latest winter blast and some of the areas of concern we're seeing around the area, one of which may be Texarkana.
And that's where we find Rick Rowe with a look at the current conditions there. Rick, you've been driving around the area for some time now. Have the conditions changed in that time?
Not really, but one of the things you just mentioned, Nate, blast. I think you're seeing a little bit of the blast this morning. Look at the gust of wind reflected in those flags. This gives you an idea that it is cold, okay? There is a wind temperature outside, it's about 30. With that wind chill, I have no idea. But be aware when you go outside, it's going to be chilly. Now, the good news is, in terms of roads, we're going to pull out onto one of the most heavily traveled roads in Texarkana. This would be Richmond Road. It's kind of the Uri Drive or the Airline Drive of Texarkana, and haven't seen any problems. We've been driving around all morning long. We're about to go over an overpass. We're going to cross over I-30. Jeff and I have been on I-30 all morning long, drove up on I-49 from Shreveport-Bossier. Not really noticing any issues. Now, there are some spots of moisture, and you may notice it here just a little bit, but nothing significant thus far. I know we always have to be aware of and make you aware of those patches of black ice that you can't see, but we haven't seen any thus far. Now, again, this is Richmond Road. Lots of travel, lots of restaurants and fast food places and retail outlets here. Heavily traveled thoroughfare, and it is dry. It is clear. And I think the wind that we talked about earlier and we showed you earlier is a factor in that dryness. There has been some moisture, obviously, earlier in the evening. We saw a little mist maybe about 30-45 minutes ago, but this heavy wind has dried things off substantially. So the bad news is, yes, it's cold and getting colder, and there is a wind that will cut right through you. The good news is the roads are largely clear, although obviously when you're on a bridge or an overpass, be aware. So good news generally. It's cold, it's windy in Texarkana, but in terms of travel, traffic is pretty good in Texarkana. Coming back to y'all.
Well, we do want to continue our live team coverage this morning with the latest on this possibility of winter weather and some areas of concern around Texarkana especially.
And our Rick Rowe has been driving around along with Jeff, the videographer, looking at the current conditions there. Rick, how's it looking?
Actually, it's a two-edged sword. You may notice here the flag at McDonald's as we turn onto Richmond Road, blowing briskly in the wind, and that is one major issue here. Is the wind chill has got to be, as Brian was mentioning earlier, in the single digits. It's about 30 degrees, 29 to 30 degrees air temperature, but when you factor in the wind, which is very brisk in Texarkana, it's got to be down into the single digits. Now let's cross over I-30. We're on Richmond Road. Richmond Road is like Uri Drive and Airline Drive, heavily traveled roadway here in Texarkana. As we cross over, this is what we talk about and what we've been talking about all morning long, bridges and overpasses. And you will notice, I'm going to let you see it for yourself, not a whole lot going on. There is some dampness to it, and it is below freezing. So again, I'm going to tell you to be careful, particularly as you go over bridges and overpasses, as we are doing this morning. But once you get onto dry land and roadway like this, that's when the wind is a good thing. It's a bad thing when you're just standing there. But I think the wind here has basically dried things out, the roadways. Everywhere that we have driven this morning, I-49 coming up from Shreveport-Bossier, I-30, now Richmond Road in Texarkana, everything has been largely dry and risk-free. Again, I don't want to leave out the fact that those bridges and overpasses we have noticed here and there little puddles of water that obviously when you have temperatures below freezing could create a problem. But traffic is flowing smoothly. So I'm going to say this two-edged sword. That wind, tough if you're out and you're going to school or work today, but it's been very, very nice in terms of traffic flow on roadways in Texarkana. Coming back to y'all.